November 24, 1944, Japanese Zero pilots scrambled over Tokyo, straining their engines to climb higher, watching helplessly as 111 American B-29 Superfortresses cruised untouchable at 32,000 feet, dropping bombs with impunity, while Japanese bullets fell uselessly through thin air, hundreds of feet below their targets. In that moment, Japan's most elite fighter aces realized they'd been sent to fight a war at an altitude their aircraft could never reach, armed with courage against an enemy that had brought physics. But how did a single American technology, the turbo-supercharger, turn the entire Pacific Air War into a one-sided slaughter that Japan's warrior spirit could never overcome? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1941, and the Empire of Japan sat at the peak of its power. From the snowy forests of Manchuria to the tropical jungles of Southeast Asia, the rising sun flag flew over conquered territories that stretched across a quarter of the globe. In Tokyo, military parades filled the streets with cheering crowds. School children sang songs about brave pilots who defended the homeland. Newspapers printed victory after victory, each headline more glorious than the last. The Japanese Zero fighter was the crown jewel of this empire. Lightweight and graceful, it could turn tighter than any enemy plane. In the hands of skilled pilots, the Zero seemed almost magical. It had swept American and British aircraft from the skies over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Singapore. By 1942, Japan controlled the Pacific Ocean like an ancient samurai controlled his sword, with total confidence and deadly precision. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai was one of these elite pilots. At 25 years old, he had already shot down 12 enemy aircraft. His hands knew every switch and lever in his Zero's cockpit without looking. He could feel the engine's rhythm through the stick, sense wind currents by the way his wings trembled. To Sakai, flying wasn't just a job, it was an art form, a meditation, a way of life. On warm evenings at the airbase on Iwo Jima, Sakai and his fellow pilots would sit outside their barracks, drinking weak tea and talking about their families back home. They spoke with pride about Japanese engineering. Their Zeros weighed less than any American fighter. This made them quick and nimble. Why would anyone want a heavy, sluggish airplane? The Americans built their planes like trucks, the pilots joked, big, clumsy, slow to turn. Japanese planes were like katana swords, sharp, light, perfect. But there were things the pilots didn't talk about, things they didn't fully understand themselves. The Zero had no armor plating to protect the pilot. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks, so a single bullet could turn the plane into a fireball. And most importantly, the Zero's engine began to choke and wheeze above 28,000 feet. At 30,000 feet, the thin air starved the engine. The controls became mushy and unresponsive. The plane felt like it was swimming through honey. Japanese engineers knew about this problem. They understood that engines needed more air pressure at high altitudes to work properly. But creating that pressure required special equipment, superchargers with precise metal parts machined to exact measurements. Japan's factories struggled with this kind of precision. The metals weren't pure enough, the tools weren't accurate enough, the fuel wasn't clean enough. So Japanese planes remained low-altitude fighters, deadly below 20,000 feet but weak above it. The military commanders told themselves this didn't matter. Why would it matter? Enemy bombers would have to fly over the ocean to reach Japan. Japanese naval forces would sink the ships carrying those bombers. And even if somehow a bomber got through, Japanese fighters would intercept it long before it reached the home islands. The idea that enemy aircraft could fly so high that Japanese fighters couldn't reach them seemed impossible. It seemed like science fiction. In smoke-filled conference rooms in Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto's staff officers studied intelligence reports about American aircraft development. The reports mentioned something called the B-29 Superfortress. American propaganda claimed it could fly higher and farther than any bomber in the world. The officers laughed at these claims. Americans were good at making movies and jazz music, they said, but serious military technology? That required discipline, sacrifice, and focus. Americans were too soft, too distracted by comfort and entertainment. One staff officer tossed a report on the table. "They say this B-29 can fly at 35,000 feet, he said with a smirk, with a full bomb load for 3,000 miles. The other officers shook their heads. "Impossible," one replied. "No engine can maintain power at that altitude. The Americans are lying to scare us." They filed the report away and moved on to other matters. Meanwhile, on scattered islands across the Pacific, Japanese radar operators sat at their stations, staring at green screens that flickered and jumped with static. The radar equipment was old, temperamental, and often broken. Many operators had only a few weeks of training. They didn't really understand how the machines worked. When the equipment acted strangely, they assumed it was malfunctioning. When they saw unusual readings, they dismissed them as errors. Sakai noticed other small problems too. The oxygen masks that pilots wore at high altitude were crude and uncomfortable. They froze in the cold air above 20,000 feet. The rubber tubes cracked. The masks leaked. Many pilots got terrible headaches from breathing bad air during long patrols. Some passed out. But complaining was not the Japanese way. You endured hardship. You pushed through pain. That was what separated warriors from ordinary men. Food was becoming scarce too, even for military personnel. Rice rations were smaller each month. Fresh vegetables were rare. The supply ships that brought food and fuel to forward bases like Iwo Jima came less frequently now. American submarines were sinking more ships every week. But the newspapers never mentioned this. They only printed stories about victories and brave sacrifices. Then came November 24, 1944. It started as an ordinary morning. Sakai ate a small breakfast of rice and pickled radish. He walked to the flight line to inspect his Zero. The ground crew had patched several bullet holes from his last mission. The patches were rough, but they would hold. Everything in the Japanese military was being patched now, held together with whatever materials could be found. At 10:30 in the morning, the air raid sirens began to wail. The sound started low and rose to a piercing shriek that made Sakai's teeth ache. This wasn't unusual. American carrier planes had been harassing Japanese bases for months. Sakai and 5 other pilots ran to their aircraft. Engines coughed to life. One by one, the Zeros rolled down the dirt runway and clawed their way into the bright sky. The radio crackled with confused voices. The radar operators were reporting something strange. Multiple aircraft, very high altitude, heading toward Tokyo. The numbers didn't make sense. 50 contacts, 70, no, more than 100, and the altitude reading kept climbing, 28,000 feet, 30,000, 32,000 feet. Sakai pushed his throttle forward and pointed his nose upward. The Zero climbed eagerly at first, but as he passed 25,000 feet, he could feel the engine losing power. The air was too thin. The engine was gasping, struggling, working harder for less result. At 28,000 feet, the Zero was barely climbing anymore. Sakai pulled back on the stick, trying to squeeze out every last bit of altitude. At 29,000 feet, he finally saw them. His breath caught in his throat. Above him, so high they looked like silver toys, flew formation after formation of enormous aircraft. They were huge, bigger than any bomber Sakai had ever seen. Their wings stretched wide and straight. Sunlight glinted off polished aluminum skin. They flew in perfect boxes of 3 and 4, dozens of them, maybe more than 100. And they weren't struggling at altitude like his Zero. They cruised smoothly, confidently, as if the thin air didn't affect them at all. Sakai's Zero shuddered and wallowed. At 30,000 feet, the controls felt dead. The engine temperature was climbing into the red zone. He could barely keep the nose up. But above him, 3,000 feet higher, the American bombers flew in perfect formation, untouchable, unreachable, like gods walking on clouds. He squeezed his trigger anyway. The Zero's guns rattled. He watched the tracers arc upward toward the nearest bomber, but something was wrong. The bullets climbed for a few seconds, then curved downward, pulled by gravity, falling away hundreds of feet before they could reach their target. The thin air robbed the bullets of speed and range. They fell like stones tossed at the moon. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The B-29 above him didn't even adjust its course. It simply flew on, steady and straight, as if Sakai didn't exist, as if his zero, his skills, his 12 victories, his warrior spirit, none of it mattered. For the first time in his career, Sakai felt something he had never felt in combat before. Not fear exactly, something worse, helplessness, irrelevance. He was a samurai swinging his sword at an enemy standing on a mountaintop he could never climb. Over the next 3 months, the silver bombers came again and again. Sometimes they came in daylight, flying so high they left white contrails across the blue sky like chalk marks on a blackboard. Sometimes they came at night, invisible except for the distant rumble of their engines and the sudden flash of explosions below. Every time, Japanese pilots scrambled to meet them. Every time, they failed. Sakai pushed his Zero to its absolute limit during a raid in early December. He climbed until his vision started to blur from lack of oxygen. His frozen fingers could barely grip the control stick. The altimeter needle trembled at 31,000 feet, higher than he had ever flown before. His engine was screaming, overheating, burning itself up just to maintain this altitude. The whole aircraft shook and rattled like it was about to fall apart. Above him, a B-29 cruised at 33,000 feet. It looked close enough to touch, but Sakai knew better now. Those 2,000 feet might as well have been 2,000 miles. He lined up his sights and fired a long burst. The guns hammered against his shoulders. He watched the tracers climb, then arc downward and disappear, falling hundreds of feet short of the target. The B-29 didn't even twitch. Its pilot probably never saw him. To them, Sakai was just a desperate insect buzzing far below, too small to notice, too weak to matter. His engine temperature gauge was buried in the red zone. Black smoke started streaming from the cowling. Sakai had to dive away before his engine seized completely. As he descended back into breathable air, he pounded his fist against the canopy in frustration. He was one of Japan's best pilots, and he couldn't even make the enemy acknowledge his existence. On the ground, intelligence officers were finally starting to understand what they faced. They studied grainy photographs of crashed B-29 parts. They interviewed civilians who had found pieces of wreckage. And slowly, piece by piece, they assembled a picture of American technology that seemed to come from another world. The heart of the B-29's power was something called a turbo-supercharger. It was a complicated machine with 2 stages of compression. As the bomber climbed higher and the air got thinner, the turbo-supercharger worked harder, spinning faster, compressing the thin air and forcing it into the engines at the same pressure as sea-level air. This meant the B-29's engines lost almost no power at high altitude. They breathed easily at 35,000 feet, even 40,000 feet. Meanwhile, Japanese engines at that altitude were suffocating, producing barely 40% of their normal power. The engineering was incredibly precise. The turbine blades inside the superchargers were machined to measurements smaller than a human hair. The bearings had to spin at 30,000 revolutions per minute without wobbling or overheating. The whole system had to work perfectly in air so cold it could freeze gasoline, at altitudes where atmospheric pressure was less than a quarter of sea level. Japanese factories couldn't build anything close to this. Their best engineers studied the American parts with growing despair. The metal alloys were stronger and lighter than anything Japan could produce. The machining was so exact that Japanese tools couldn't measure the tolerances, let alone match them. One engineer held up a turbine blade and simply shook his head. "We are 5 years behind," he said quietly. "Maybe 10. But the altitude advantage was just the beginning of the humiliation. When Japanese forces finally captured a downed B-29 crew in January 1945, the intelligence officers couldn't believe what they found in the aircraft's survival kit. There were chocolate bars, condensed milk, coffee, sugar cubes, cigarettes, water purification tablets, a first aid kit with real morphine, and emergency rations that contained more calories than a Japanese pilot received in 3 days. One officer held up a can of Spam and stared at it like it was a gold bar. "They give this to their pilots," he whispered, "to carry in case of emergency. We can't even feed this well to our combat troops." The stories from interrogated American prisoners made things worse. The B-29 crews talked casually about their missions. They called the easy ones milk runs, as if flying to Japan and back was no more dangerous than delivering bottles to your neighbor's house. They mentioned eating hot meals during the flight, heated by electrical systems that Japanese aircraft could never carry. They complained about being cold in their pressurized cabins, not realizing that Japanese pilots at the same altitude were wearing 3 layers of clothing and still freezing, breathing through masks that leaked and froze. One captured American navigator mentioned that crews rotated home after 35 missions. 35 missions? Then you went back to America, back to your family, back to normal life. Japanese pilots flew until they died. There was no rotation, no going home. You either got shot down or you volunteered for a kamikaze mission when your aircraft became too damaged to repair. The contrast was staggering. Americans treated war like a job with shifts and breaks. Japanese treated it like a sacred duty that ended only in death. The production numbers were even more crushing. American factories were building B-29s faster than Japan could build any aircraft. At peak production, Boeing's plant in Wichita, Kansas, rolled out one finished B-29 every 63 minutes. Every hour, another giant bomber was completed, fueled, armed, and ready to fly. Japan's entire aircraft industry, working at maximum capacity, couldn't match even 1 day of American B-29 production. Sakai sat in this barracks one night holding a small piece of B-29 wreckage that he'd picked up near the airfield. It was part of a turbo-supercharger, a curved blade of polished steel that caught the lamplight like a mirror. The metal was cool and smooth in his hands. He turned it over slowly, studying the precise curves, the perfect balance, the quality of the workmanship. He thought about everything he'd been taught since childhood. Americans were weak and lazy. They loved comfort too much to be good warriors. They had no discipline, no spirit, no honor. Japanese fighting spirit would overcome American technology. Bushido would defeat materialism. These ideas had been repeated so many times they seemed like obvious truth. But this piece of metal told a different story. This wasn't the work of lazy, undisciplined people. This was precision engineering at the highest level. This was the product of factories working with incredible efficiency, workers trained to exact standards, scientists and engineers solving problems that Japanese experts couldn't even attempt. Every B-29 that flew overhead carried thousands of parts like this blade, each one machined perfectly, each one working together in a system so complex it seemed almost alive. Sakai wrote in his journal that night, his hand shaking slightly from exhaustion and cold. "We were told American pilots were soft, their machines crude," he wrote. "Today, I watched silver fortresses cross our sky like gods walking above the clouds. Our bullets cannot reach them, our courage cannot touch them, and I am beginning to understand that everything we believed about this war was wrong." The breaking point came on the night of March 9, 1945. Sakai was sleeping in his barracks when the sirens began wailing at midnight. He pulled on his flight suit and stumbled into the cold darkness. Above him, the sky throbbed with a deep, rhythmic sound, like distant thunder that never stopped. It was the sound of hundreds of engines, all flying together, all heading toward Tokyo. This time, the B-29s came low, just 7,000 feet above the ground. Sakai's heart leaped. Finally, the Americans were coming down to where Japanese fighters could reach them. Finally, there would be a real fight. He ran to his Zero and took off into a sky that glowed orange on the horizon. At first, he thought it was sunrise, but sunrise was still hours away. Then he realized what he was seeing. Tokyo was burning. 334 B-29s had come that night. They carried no regular bombs. Instead, their bellies were full of incendiary devices, small cylinders packed with jellied gasoline that stuck to everything and burned at temperatures hot enough to melt steel. The bombers flew in a careful pattern, dropping their loads in a grid that turned 16 square miles of Tokyo into a sea of fire. Sakai climbed toward the nearest bomber, his engine finally working properly in the thicker air. He got close enough to see the aircraft clearly for the first time. It was enormous, bigger than a house, with 4 massive propellers and a tail gunner who spotted Sakai immediately and opened fire. Tracers streaked past his canopy. Sakai rolled away and tried to line up another attack, but everywhere he looked there were more bombers. Dozens of them. Too many to count, too many to stop. He dove at one and fired until his guns went empty. He saw his bullets hitting the B-29's wing, sparking off the aluminum skin. But the bomber kept flying. It didn't even slow down. The damage he'd done was like throwing pebbles at a tank. He pulled away and headed back to base to rearm, but by the time he landed, refueled, and took off again, the raid was already ending. The B-29s were disappearing into the darkness over the Pacific, untouched, their mission complete. When dawn came, Sakai flew over Tokyo to see the damage. What he saw made him feel sick. The entire eastern part of the city was gone. Not damaged, gone. Where neighborhoods had stood yesterday, there was now just ash and twisted metal. The fires were still burning, sending up columns of black smoke that rose miles into the sky. He learned later that 100,000 people had died that night. 100,000 in a single raid that lasted less than 3 hours. Back at the base, Sakai sat on the ground outside his damaged barracks and stared at nothing. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Other pilots walked past him like ghosts, their faces blank with shock. No one spoke. What was there to say? They had been trained their entire lives to defend Japan. They had sacrificed everything, fought with every ounce of skill and courage they possessed, and it hadn't mattered at all. A week later, a staff officer came to brief the surviving pilots. He was an older man with gray hair and tired eyes. He didn't give them the usual speech about fighting spirit and ultimate victory. Instead, he told them the truth. The Americans are producing one B-29 every 63 minutes, he said. His voice was flat, emotionless. We are shooting down approximately 2% of the bombers that attack us. At this rate, they can simply overwhelm us with numbers. They will burn every city in Japan, one by one, and there is nothing we can do to stop them. One young pilot stood up angrily. Then we'll use kamikaze attacks. We'll crash into them. We'll sacrifice ourselves. The staff officer looked at him with something like pity. We've already tried that, he said quietly. The B-29s fly too high for most kamikaze aircraft to reach, and when we do reach them, they have so much defensive firepower that most of our pilots are shot down before they can hit anything. Even our deaths are ineffective now. That night, Sakai took out the piece of turbo-supercharger he'd been keeping. He held it up to the lamplight and really looked at it, not just at the metal itself, but at what it represented. This wasn't just a machine part. This was proof of a kind of power that Japan had never understood. Americans hadn't just built a better airplane, they had built a better everything. Better factories, better materials, better training, better organization, better systems. They had created an entire industrial civilization that could produce miracles like this turbine blade by the millions, install them in bombers by the hundreds, and fly those bombers across an ocean to burn cities that thought they were safe. All his life, Sakai had been taught that spirit was stronger than material things, that Japanese warriors could overcome any obstacle through sheer willpower and determination, that sacrifice and honor were the highest values. And he still believed in honor. He still believed in duty. But he finally understood that honor alone couldn't compress air. Courage alone couldn't supercharge an engine. Bushido alone couldn't machine metal to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. "They told us Americans were weak," he said out loud to the empty room. "They told us Americans cared too much about comfort and entertainment to be real warriors. But these machines didn't build themselves. Weak people don't create technology like this. Lazy people don't organize factories that can build a bomber every hour. We've been fighting an idea of America that our propaganda created. But the real America has been flying 10,000 feet above us all along, unreachable, unstoppable, and we never even saw it until the bombs started falling." He thought about everything that would come next. More raids, more cities burning, more pilots dying in aircraft that couldn't compete, and eventually, defeat. Total defeat. Because you couldn't win a war by simply being brave. You also had to be smart, organized, efficient, and technologically advanced. Japan had courage, but America had everything else, including courage of their own. The worst part was knowing that this outcome had been inevitable from the start. The moment Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the moment they started a war with a nation that could build B-29s and the turbo-superchargers that powered them, the ending was already written. Everything since then has just been the slow, painful process of Japanese warriors learning what their leaders should have told them from the beginning. You cannot defeat physics with philosophy. You cannot overcome engineering with emotion. And altitude you cannot reach might as well be another universe entirely. Sakai survived the war. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, he was still alive, still able to walk and think and remember. Many of his fellow pilots were not so lucky. Most had died in the final desperate months, throwing themselves against American bombers and aircraft held together with wire and prayers, burning the last drops of fuel that Japan could scrape together. The journey home took 3 weeks. Sakai traveled by train through a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Cities were flattened. Factories were hollow shells with their roofs blown off. Rice fields were untended, choked with weeds. People walked along the roads carrying everything they owned in small bundles, searching for relatives who might still be alive, looking for any place that still had food and shelter. When Sakai finally reached his family's village, he almost didn't recognize it. The main street was empty. Half the houses had been torn down for firewood during the last winter of the war. His mother was still alive, but she had aged 20 years in the 5 years he'd been gone. She hugged him and cried, and he felt how thin she was, how her bones pressed against his chest through her worn cotton dress. That first night home, Sakai unpacked his small canvas bag. He had almost nothing. A spare uniform, too threadbare to wear anymore. A photograph of his squadron, most of them dead now. And the piece of B-29 turbo-supercharger, wrapped carefully in cloth. His mother saw him holding it and asked what it was. He tried to explain, but how could you explain to someone who'd never seen an airplane up close? How could you make them understand that this curved piece of metal represented the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death, between two completely different ways of understanding the world? A few weeks later, Sakai traveled to Hiroshima to look for a cousin who had lived there before the war. The train stopped several miles outside the city because the tracks were melted. Sakai walked the rest of the way. As he got closer, the destruction became more complete. First, the buildings were just damaged. Then they were burned. Then they were flattened. And finally, they simply ceased to exist. At the center of the city, there was nothing but smooth ash, as if a giant hand had erased everything and left only a blank page. One bomb had done this. One bomb, carried by one B-29, dropped by one crew. Sakai stood in the ruins and tried to imagine the power required to destroy an entire city in a single flash of light. It was the same power he'd seen in that turbo-supercharger blade, magnified 1,000,000 times. It was the power of a nation that could split atoms the way Japanese swordsmiths split steel, with precision and purpose and absolute confidence in their technical ability. He never found his cousin. No one could tell him what had happened to her. There were no records, no graves, no way to know who had died in that first instant of light and heat. She had simply vanished, along with 70,000 other people, erased by American engineering. Over the next few years, as Japan slowly began to rebuild, Sakai found work as a teacher. He taught mathematics and science at a small school in Tokyo. The students were hungry and wore patched clothes, but they were eager to learn. They asked Sakai about the war sometimes. They wanted to hear about aerial combat, about dogfights and victories. But Sakai didn't tell them those stories. Instead, he talked about the B-29. He brought the turbo-supercharger blade to class one day and passed it around. The students held it carefully, feeling its weight, tracing the smooth curves with their fingers. This piece of metal won the war, Sakai told them. Not by itself, of course, but it represents something important. The Americans didn't defeat us because they were braver or because they hated us more. They defeated us because they built better tools. They understand that modern war isn't won by spirit alone. It's won by engineering, by precision, by the ability to turn natural resources into advanced technology. One student raised his hand. But Sensei, we were told that Japanese fighting spirit was invincible. We were told that Bushido would overcome any enemy. Sakai nodded slowly. Fighting spirit is important, he said. Courage is important. Honor is important. I still believe that. But spirit cannot compress air. Courage cannot supercharge an engine. We sent brave men to fight at altitudes their aircraft couldn't reach, with equipment that couldn't compete, based on information that wasn't true. We told ourselves comfortable lies about American weakness while they built bombers that could fly higher than our fighters could climb. That's not honor, that's foolishness. By the 1950s, Japan was beginning its economic recovery. American occupation forces had brought new ideas, new technologies, new ways of organizing factories and businesses. Sakai watched as Japanese companies started studying American industrial methods. They learned about quality control, about precision manufacturing, about the importance of getting every detail exactly right. They learned the lessons that should have been learned before the war, when there was still time to change course. Sakai was invited to speak at technical universities sometimes. Engineering students wanted to hear from someone who had actually fought against American technology. He always brought the turbo-supercharger blade. He would hold it up and tell them, "This is what we were fighting. Not just a machine, but an entire philosophy of manufacturing." Every B-29 had thousands of parts like this, each one machined to incredible precision. The Americans didn't just build good airplanes. They built the tools to build the tools to build the airplanes. They created entire systems of engineering education, factory management, and quality control. That's what real industrial power looks like. In 1975, 30 years after the war ended, a young journalist interviewed Sakai for a magazine article about wartime experiences. The journalist asked if Sakai hated the Americans for what they had done. Sakai was quiet for a long time before answering. "How could I hate them?" he finally said. "I hated what they represented at the time, yes. They were proof that everything we'd been told was a lie. But hate? No. The B-29 didn't just bomb our cities. It bombed our worldview. Every mission flown at 33,000 feet was a message we refused to hear until it was too late. Your courage cannot reach us. Your sacrifice cannot touch us. Your entire understanding of this war is wrong. He picked up the turbo-supercharger blade from his desk, where it had sat for 30 years, and turned it in the light. The Americans didn't just outfight us. They outthought us, outbuilt us, out-engineered us, while we were busy believing that warrior spirit could defeat the laws of physics. I keep this on my desk not as a war trophy, but as a reminder. Reality doesn't care about your ideology. Nature doesn't negotiate. And the nation that understands this first usually wins. Through the window of his small office, Sakai could see the Tokyo skyline, glittering with new buildings, cranes everywhere, commerce flowing through clean streets. Above the city, a commercial airliner passed overhead, its engines, descendants of those turbo-superchargers, pushing it effortlessly through the thin air at 35,000 feet. Japan had learned its lesson. The question was whether the rest of the world would remember it, or whether another generation would have to learn it again the hard way, at an altitude they couldn't reach, against an enemy they didn't understand, in a war that was already lost before the first shot was fired. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.